Hello and welcome to Afternoon Tea with Karen. Different trains, same destination.
At a 3-day Marxism conference held at Melbourne University, more than 1,000 people turned up and ignored how every Marxist revolution has ended in tyranny, how Marxism has killed more than 100 million people, and they chanted for yet another Marxist revolution.
Now, this is an associate professor from Melbourne University, Holly Longford-Smith.
Now, because I'm finding even for myself, discussing this can sometimes, I feel bad sometimes discussing it because there is this kind of play happening in my mind where I understand that I should be advocating for the rights of people and, allowing people to have big choices in their life. But then I also understand that, the rights of women and the rights of men, the rights of parents are all distinct in some way.
Yeah.
And they should be respected as such. So having that complex for me is hard because sometimes I feel like I am potentially being bigoted or whatever they're claiming when I say that this person doesn't belong in this space. How do people navigate this today and, find a path forward to actually discuss this issue?
Yeah, I guess there's a couple of things in your question, right? One is like how to navigate this feeling of wanting to speak your mind but not be a bigot, right? And then the other thing is the practical matter of like how to start doing it in your own context.
Because I don't care. Like I cop it online for
Yeah.
having these views. And I'm happy to express them and take the arrows or whatever it is, like whatever's being said to me.
Yeah.
And I think, you yourself being going to these women's rights rallies and a lot of the people that are involved in activism
Yeah.
of some sort, they don't mind
Yeah.
what usually happens in terms of what's said about them. But the everyday person usually would look at this and be like, I don't want to get involved in this.
They mind, yeah. No, I understand that. I guess at a certain point though, maybe this is going to sound harsh, but like we can't all be cowards, right? Like that, and I don't mean to like call a coward anyone who doesn't take action. I understand people have really complicated and good reasons for not speaking out when they feel uncomfortable or they know something's not right. But there's a collective action problem there, right? Like you can't all, I'm just going to put it in terms of like slavery, right? It's like you can't all just be slaves and hope someone else does the revolution, right? Like you have to get some people that are going to like do a violent overthrow for everyone else's benefit. And there's always like high first mover costs. So this person's really going to risk like just getting murdered in retaliation. That's, of course it's rational not to be that guy, but someone has to be that guy, right? And others have to be the second ones and others, so, that lesson, that sort of structure of how do we get out of a terrible situation when it's risky for the individual to act or to go first, that applies right now. So we're being told really forcefully that like this narrative around gender identity ideology, or that some would say gender identity theory, is true, can't be questioned. If you question it, you're unkind, you hate trans people, you don't want them to exist, you want them dead, blah, 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 right? So force down everyone's throat this idea that like you absolutely cannot ask questions about this, even if your questions are motivated by care for children, care for lesbian and gay youth, care for women, right? Wanting appropriate safeguarding. Oh no, all of that is just unkind and you're a bigot and you don't care enough about trans people. Someone is going to have to be willing to be unkind, right? And that's quote unquote unkind because it's just an accusation. But if no one's willing, then we just end up with that situation. So there's not really an alternative, right? It's like, so just who's it going to be? And I think that segues nicely to the question of the practical thing. How do we actually do it? Well, it has been my observation that like this fight to have this issue like put on the table as a serious conflict of rights between different groups, where it's not just unkind or bigoted to question any of the claims of trans activism, that fight has to be fought in every single workplace, every single school, every single city council, every single country's government. And it just has to be like negotiated to a point that like it's not plausible for the activists that try to shut everyone down to like be in the dominant position. And we, at least in Australia, have the luxury of.
Right. Now, I know more pig shooters than I know feminists. However, the next Victorian state election is the 28th of November 26, and the next federal one has to be before May, I think in 2025. Don't fact check me with the May thing. Potentially it could be next year. However, the biggest obstacle to overcome, other than the lack of politicians that aren't into imagination land, is, well, I'll let this guy tell you about it.
During the 80s and the 90s. And this is something people don't talk enough about, and shows what is important about the way people organise and why unions are important. Advances like the abolition of Section 28, same-sex civil partnership, same-sex marriage and adoption, weren't won because some nice people decided this from above and kind governments granted our rights. It came about through the struggle of working people alongside LGBT plus people. It's important to explain the change for LGBT plus people in society. It's impossible to explain the change for LGBT plus people in society without acknowledging this. In the annual British Social Attitudes published every year, in 1983, 50% of British people saw homosexuality as always wrong. Only 70% thought homosexuality was, quote, okay. This figure for people who accepted homosexuality as okay fell to as low as 11% during the panic about AIDS in 1987. By 2016, though, there was a 60% approval rate for gay marriage. How did that change? Well, I'll tell you, my argument, and I think it's an important argument to have, is that that struggle came from below. Unions were at the forefront of moving to positive public acceptance of lesbian and gay rights in the late 80s, and were way ahead of the curve of public opinion in society. None of these advances would have happened if there had not been a movement within the working class and in the trade unions that fought for LGBT plus rights. Anyone who's seen the film Pride about the connection between lesbian and gay support the miners and the South Wales miners during the Great Strike of 84-85 can see how ideas changed in struggle. But that had a domino effect. And what happened after that was that so much changed. Those connections between LGBT plus people and support groups and unions had huge repercussions. For example, since the mid-80s onwards, every trade union now has LGBT plus representation and policy. The Labour Party changed its position. And, of course, trade unions are mass organisations, which alongside other labour movement organisations have a huge reach out to millions of working class people. This is how things can change. This is how ideas can change. And I do think it's impossible to explain that change without understanding that context. These changes were too late to develop a fully concerted campaign to stop Section 28 in the late 80s, early 90s, but were key in forcing Blair's government to abolish Section 28 in 2003. And I think this is important to understand today when we think about how we develop a movement, a radical movement that can stand up to bigotry and fight for liberation. Union organisation and the working class can be at the centre of pushing for change. And that's why I think London Trans Pride this year, and it's the leaflet on your in front of you, is going to be so important. In my union in the NEU, over the last 2 years, we've taken about a third of all London NEU banners onto the London Trans Pride. This year we want to see more, and I'm working with B. Hughes, who just spoke, in the UCU and with other unions to make that even bigger, so that we have a trade union block on Trans Pride this year that stands out and shows that the left and the unions can fight for trans rights. It means and in doing that, when we've won that position, it's meant that members have put motions of support in their union groups. They've won that and then taken people to Trans Pride alongside their banners. So the argument is had in the working class about why it's important to support trans rights, and the strike, the link between class struggle and the fight for liberation is made. It meant that lots of NEU members came on the march to represent their areas. There were over 10,000 on the first year. Last year it went to 20,000. This year we want to see many, many more thousands. And I think that's important, because then I think it shows the importance of the fight. It shows that unions are behind it, but it also gives strength to those people who are fighting against transphobia wherever they are. Within the NEU, trans and non-binary rights have been at the centre of the union's concerns for the last 5 years. During that time, we've won support for GRA reform, support for a union definition of transphobia, and the development of trans and non-binary inclusive education strategies in schools. I have also helped design with others an LGBT plus charter to go into schools, which has trans and non-binary materials for students, so that those go into safe spaces for students to discuss within schools. It's also important that we have strong unions in education, where 64% of trans students have been bullied, and homophobic bullying still continues. In doing so, we've helped marginalise some of the leading members of our NEU union who have publicly supported Women's Place UK. We've put the argument that the struggle against transphobia and the struggle against women's oppression is entirely compatible and not in conflict. And because we've argued this in a positive way to try to make it the common sense of the union, we have won over so many of those in the centre ground of the arguments. These arguments are bound to reoccur, but we're in a good position to win them. It's important to understand that oppression is driven from the top. The media echo that, and that's why it sometimes appears that transphobia can be overwhelming. But the mass of working people are open to be won over, and there are millions of people in unions who we can win over in that discussion. Our unions are a key way to organise against transphobia. We have a world to win, and we can win it.
So, there's a bit of that. See you later. Bye.